When most of us picture a funeral, we picture flowers, a gathered family, and a few quiet words said in someone's memory. But across Britain today, a rising number of people are leaving the world with almost none of that, and the reason is not who they were, but what dying now costs. This is a quiet crisis unfolding at the very end of life, and a story about the country we have become. For generations in Britain, the expectation of a simple, dignified funeral rested quietly within the social contract. In the 1970s, a national guide placed the cost of a basic service at around £300, an amount that, even adjusted for inflation, falls far below what is asked today. By 2026, the average price of a simple attended funeral stands at £3,828, a figure that shadows many households in quiet disbelief. The difference is not just arithmetic. It signals a deeper change in what society promises at the end of life. Consider the story of a pensioner in Cornwall who spent years on modest wages and lived carefully, only to face a funeral quote of £2,500, still beyond reach, and her wishes were simple. No extravagance, just a respectful farewell. Yet even this, once assumed as a birthright, now comes with a price tag that for many is simply unattainable. The old assurance that death would not bring financial shame or debt has faded, replaced by a Titan system where dignity at the end depends on the ability to pay. The quiet question lingers: when did a decent goodbye become something that needs to be afforded? Behind the headline price of a funeral, a quieter force is at work, one that often escapes notice until the bill arrives. The sum a family faces is not determined by the funeral director alone, but by a patchwork of third-party charges with council-run crematorium fees at the heart of the increase. Between 2015 and 2022, the standard fee for a council cremation in Britain rose from £392 to £960. In the northeast, the escalation has been even more pronounced, with a 112% increase over the last decade. Northumberland County Council, for example, raised its cremation fee from £620 to £1,310, citing higher operating costs and environmental requirements. These are not isolated cases, but part of a national pattern that quietly reshapes the cost of saying goodbye. For families, these numbers are not abstract. In Sheffield, one household received a receipt listing a single crematorium charge of £750, more than double what neighbouring councils demanded just a few years before. Such figures arrive with a cold finality, often at a moment when grief leaves little room for financial negotiation. The pressure comes not from extravagance, but from a system where each line item, set by separate authorities, accumulates into a total that few anticipate. The mechanics of the modern funeral bill reveal a landscape in which dignity is priced by forces beyond any one family's control, and where the true cost of farewell is built, quietly, fee by fee. Inside the quiet of a family home, the cost of a funeral becomes more than a figure on a page. For roughly 1 in 8 British families, the loss of a loved one is shadowed by the fear of not being able to pay for a final farewell. Each year, around 90,000 households find themselves taking out loans to bridge the gap between what is needed and what can be afforded. The sums are not small, and the choices are rarely straightforward. Some turn to banks or credit cards, but tens of thousands, unable to secure mainstream credit, approach high-cost lenders or even illegal loan sharks, often with little time to consider the consequences. In Birmingham, a single mother waits nearly 3 weeks to lay her father to rest, her days measured out in anxious phone calls and paperwork as she waits for a government funeral payment to clear. The delay is not just a matter of logistics, and it stretches grief into uncertainty as the ceremony is postponed until the money can be found. In Liverpool, a young couple negotiates a £1,500 loan from a family-run finance firm, the terms unclear in their distress. For many, the only alternative is to ask friends or relatives for help, or to accept a pared-back service that feels at odds with the life they are trying to honour. Debt becomes part of the mourning period, woven into the rituals of loss. The need to borrow, to wait, or to compromise adds a quiet strain to families already carrying the weight of bereavement. Funeral poverty, once a phrase used by campaigners, now describes the reality for thousands. The pressure is not the result of extravagance, but of a widening gap between what a dignified goodbye costs and what ordinary households can manage. In these moments, the promise of a simple, respectful send-off is tested, and the question of who is responsible for dignity at the end of life becomes more than a private concern. When a person dies in Britain and no one steps forward to arrange their funeral, the responsibility quietly passes to the local authority. This is not an act of charity, but a legal obligation set out in Section 46, one of the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. If no suitable arrangements are being made because there are no relatives, or none willing or able to pay, the council must ensure a burial or cremation takes place. Each day, around 12 such funerals are arranged across the country, a rhythm of necessity that costs the public purse close to £6 million a year. The process is deliberate and restrained. A public health funeral officer receives a referral, sometimes from a coroner, sometimes from a hospital or social worker. There is paperwork to check, confirmation that no one else is taking responsibility, verification that the deceased's assets are insufficient. The arrangements are pared back, but the duty is absolute. The officer contracts a licensed funeral director, schedules a cremation or burial, and records the expense in the council's register. Roughly a quarter of these funerals are handled by NHS hospitals, who step in when a patient dies alone and unclaimed. There is little ceremony and often no mourners. Yet even in these quiet, unadorned moments, the state's responsibility is clear: to see that no one is left without a final act of care. The question lingers, gentle but insistent. What does it say about a society when this quiet duty grows year on year? Across the United Kingdom, the shape of family life is changing in ways that quietly reshape the experience of loss. Today, 8.6 million people live alone, a figure that now stands at nearly 30% of all households. Behind these numbers are older men and women who have outlived spouses, siblings, and sometimes even their own children. More than half of those living alone are aged 65 or over, carrying the long memory of a world where family ties once seemed unbreakable. For many, the final years unfold in a flat or a small house, with neighbours as passing acquaintances and the nearest relative hours away. Longevity, once a symbol of fortune, can bring a quiet isolation when support networks thin and the old bonds are lost to time. In these circumstances, the practicalities of a funeral fall not to kin but to distant friends, neighbours, or the state. The cost of dying is not only measured in pounds, but in the absence of those who might once have stood by the graveside. As more people reach the end of life alone, the question of who will remember and who will arrange a final farewell grows ever more pressing. The promise of support at the end of life is now defined by numbers that quietly fail to keep pace with reality. The funeral expenses payment, meant as a safety net for those on low incomes, is capped at £1,985. a figure that has not changed since 2004. In the years since, the average cost of a simple funeral has more than doubled, yet the state's contribution remains frozen, now covering less than half of even the most modest bill. For many, the gap between what is offered and what is required is not a matter of a few pounds, but a gulf that shapes the entire experience of loss. This mismatch is not accidental. There is no automatic link between the payment and the rising costs of funerals. So each year, the real value of the support quietly erodes. Meanwhile, the market itself has consolidated. Dignity, one of the largest funeral providers, operates around 46 crematoria across the country. The majority stake is held by Castlenow, a private investment group, and reported profit margins exceed 15%, far above the growth of most household incomes. When a small number of firms control a growing share of the market, price competition weakens and the cost to families rises further. What looks like a personal struggle to pay is, in truth, the product of a system where public support is static and market pressure is relentless. The question is not just whether a family can afford a funeral, but how a society decides what dignity at the end of life is worth. Today, more than 5,000 public health funerals take place in Britain each year, quiet farewells where no family can pay. As costs rise and connection thins, the final kindness owed to every life is left to strangers. What does a society lose when dignity at the end becomes a privilege? Share your thoughts below.